Thank you, Madam
looked up
Speaker.
too far.
I didn't think my riding had migrated across provincial borders. We have had substantial mudslides. We've certainly had a lot of infrastructure damage, but it's still Saanich, Gulf Islands. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I do want to address Bill C-8. I want to make sure it's clear that I will be voting for it, but I find it inadequate. And in that, my views are shared by that honourable member for Kitchener Centre. I want to reflect on his excellent points in his speech, especially relating to the housing tax. Look, we have a speech that was given by our Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister on December 14th. We're now debating it on February 7th. Things change very rapidly right now. I think when the Deputy Prime Minister gave the speeches, I think back to December 14th, we wouldn't have believed that we would be dealing with such a strain on our healthcare system, that the Omicron virus would be so very transmissible, so many people would be getting sick, that we would have the country in a state of, well, at least the national capital in a state of occupation with nerves frayed. I think we, just as an opening comment to all my friends on all sides of the House, we need to do whatever we can do as parliamentarians to display a nonpartisan spirit of care and love for each other as neighbours and as Canadians. I've always felt that a hallmark of a Canadian debate is when we can agree to disagree without being disagreeable. We're at real risk here. I never would have imagined in a million years that I'd read on, as I did on Twitter today, that there were any such things as protesters in the nation's capital who thought it was a good idea to start a fire in a lobby of an apartment building. This is, we really do need to find ways to reach out even to those people who are part of the convoy, who think they're in a glorious moment of grassroots democracy, to say, please respect each other. Please be careful. Please go home. As for Bill C-8, the parts of it, for those who haven't studied it, those who might be watching on CPAC or at home, the elements of it are all understandable, particularly with a lens on December 14th. There was a sense that perhaps we're coming out of pandemic. There's not nearly enough economic relief here for Canadians who are now experiencing, they're not coming out of pandemic as we thought we might be. The cutting of the benefit from $500 a month to $500 to $300 is completely unacceptable. And we know we need to see that improved. I certainly hope that the government ministers recognize that that needs to change. Yes, it's a good thing to see $1.72 billion for rapid testing. I agree with many of the opposition colleagues who have said, why did it take so long? Why didn't we have more focus on testing earlier? I experienced what it's like to have daily rapid testing when I was on the Canadian government delegation to the climate negotiations in Glasgow at COP26. It was really interesting to know that the National Health Service in the UK could manage to test 35,000 people every single day. Well, we tested ourselves and send in the results, and then you had to be double checked. It did keep COP26 from being a super spreader event. They worked hard. I think we need to look at testing, and I'm glad to see this money is in the budget. I spent much of months of last year trying to prepare for going back to school fall 2020. I worked extensively with people in the Minister of Finance's office and Deputy Prime Minister's office and attempted to reach all the ministers of education across the country with a simple idea that the spaces that were shut down because people weren't allowed to congregate, community centers and empty buildings of all kinds, whether hotels or convention centers, could be put to use for schools with greater distancing for children and better ventilation. Of course, as ever, the barriers here were provincial jurisdiction over education and the federal government basically having the role of providing the money once the provinces ask for it. In that spirit, I think it's really late that we're getting around to ventilation in schools. But I don't uniquely blame the federal government for how long it's taken, because I know where the barriers lie in provincial governments not asking. If a provincial government says, please, we need money to ventilate our schools better, I'm glad to see the federal government and that we as parliamentarians will approve that and write the check. But this should have happened before our kids, and in my case, my daughter is a teacher, so children, teachers, all going into a space which could have been made safer more than a year ago. Well, it will take some time to use this money to better ventilate schools, but I'm glad it's finally happening. So the measures here are good measures. The measure on the so-called underused housing tax, or what I could have been better described as a speculative investor housing tax, is at 1% a very small step in the right direction. We've seen the housing market skewed on the lower mainland of this province, British Columbia, as well as Vancouver Island, as well as throughout the province now, because COVID has led people to realize I can work from home. I can buy a home anywhere. We've seen a real distortion, but a lot of that distortion has been people buying houses for investments, Airbnbs, foreigners who keep the house empty. A 1% tax is good, but as the Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre said in his speech, if your house is like waiting for a fire department to show up and your house is on fire, they come up with one bucket. It's not going to do the job. So this will be a good first step. Perhaps we'll learn from it and extend it to being a more meaningful tax to keep people from speculating in the housing market. Houses should be homes first and not investments, particularly for those who don't plan to live in that house as their home. Madam Speaker, there's much more I could say about what's in the bill. I want to talk about some of the things that aren't there. We need, of course, more support on the EI front. There's EI changes in this bill, but we need more. We need more support for individuals who are falling between the cracks. But we also need to talk about what the real threat is globally of different mutating forms of COVID-19. We know, and we've heard many members on all sides of the House say, until everyone on the planet is vaccinated, until vaccine equity takes place between the industrialized world and the developing world, we won't be through with what is now basically a giant petri dish of humanity, with the virus being more in charge than humans. We need to make sure that developing country citizens get access to vaccines. Here we are, I'm double vaxxed and I've had a booster. And millions of people around the world haven't had a single first shot. We need to get big pharma out of the way. And to do that, Canada needs to side with India and South Africa at the World Trade Organization and support a waiver under the trade-related intellectual property regime, such that developing countries can manufacture their own vaccines without patent protection to the larger pharmaceutical companies. I will note these larger pharmaceutical companies themselves received millions and millions of dollars from governments around the world in order to speed the development of vaccines for COVID-19. I don't think they deserve any patent protection or profits out of this. I think some of the anti-vax protests that we see would be much reduced if the additional argument, which is really a logical fallacy, just because Big Pharma is a terrible group that collectively, I think, represents a sort of a global version of organized crime, just because of that, people are angry at the vaccinations. Well, you can be both, looking at Big Pharma and saying you don't deserve a profit out of this, and at the same time saying vaccinations are essential for public health. In any case, Madam Speaker, I would have liked to have seen in this bill a commitment to move forward to get vaccinations to the developing world. I also look at this bill in the context of the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister's speech back on December 14th. She noted that the province of British Columbia had just been walloped over and over again. We had a heat dome that killed 600 British Columbians in 4 days. We had an extremely stressful emergency summer of evacuations and stretched wildfire response to thousands of fires across the province. And of course, just before this fiscal update was delivered, we had the loss of billions of dollars of infrastructure, lost lives, and devastating impacts for Abbotsford, for all up the Fraser Valley. And we still hear the Prime Minister's voice saying, "We're with you, Lytton. We will help you rebuild." Just in point of fact, nothing has happened to help rebuild Lytton. There is not a new housing permit out there. We have a lot of backlog to make up for from climate impacts that have already occurred. And yet, as I speak today on February 7th, Canada's target to hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we committed to do in the climate negotiations in Paris remains unfulfilled. Even our promises won't get us there, much less our weak delivery. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And the member made reference to the importance of one aspect of the bill that I think many Canadians are interested in, and that's where we're putting in a 1% tax for non-residents, non-Canadians, where there's vacancies. We recognize across the country that we do need to deal more with the housing issue. We have really quite a large field of areas such as rapid housing initiatives, the housing strategy, working with provinces. And my question to the member is, would she not agree that in dealing with the housing crisis that Canada is facing, that it's going to take more than just a federal government? I'm looking more so at municipalities and provinces and their investments, and if she can just provide her thoughts from that perspective.
The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I totally agree with the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. This is a moment where multiple levels of government, multiple orders of government are involved. There was a period of time when the federal government took a hands-off approach to housing. I welcome the fact that CMHC has made a commitment that housing is a right and that Canadians should have affordable housing. There was more the federal government could do. We used to have special tax treatment to encourage developers to build purpose-built rental housing. We have some of those programs now, but they're highly specialized, and they increasingly say, well, you can build this property, but a small fraction has to stay below market. We need below market pricing for rents. We have a huge problem with vacancy levels for people to rent a decent home. We also have, as we know, unaffordability to buy a home. But we need to look at smart development in our urban areas, in our communities, and look at infill and find ways to promote smart housing, particularly cooperative.
Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Laurentides-Labelle.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I applaud my colleague because I obviously agree with most of what she said. With all the wisdom experience she has, I would like her to explain how Quebec and the provinces, organizations that defend the interests of healthcare workers, public opinion has been asking for immediate health transfers to be done. The government says that it's given billions of dollars to deal with the pandemic. That doesn't change anything. So I was hoping that maybe my colleague could explain what the Prime Minister is waiting for to do this. It is urgent.
For Saanich Gulf Islands.
Oui, merci. Merci à ma collègue.
Yes, thank you to my colleague. I agree entirely. However, I cannot explain the reasons for which the Prime Minister is waiting. As always, we have to work in a spirit of cooperation between the provinces and the federal government. And, as always in our country, it's the same story of conflicts between the government in Ottawa and the government in Quebec or Toronto. We have to work together in order to protect our public health care system that is universal.
Question, the Honourable Member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank the member from Saanich Gulf Islands for her thoughtful remarks. I always enjoy hearing what she has to say here. I just wanted to let her pick up on where she left off on the cost of inaction on climate change. We lived the effects of climate change this past year. We're seeing immense costs, and I'm just wondering if she could comment further on the ambition that this government has to show, not only to fight climate change, but to adapt to it, because we're stuck with it for the rest of our lives.
Brief answer from the member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you to the Honourable Member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay, who is one of the more thoughtful and scientifically literate people in this place. I am grateful he's here. My brief answer is we have a very brief amount of time to ensure that the climate impacts we experience are survivable. I don't think we talk enough in this place about worst case scenarios. We assume a rosy future in which we adjust and adapt to bad weather. That's not what we're facing. We're facing an existential threat to human civilization, and it requires courage. And that's what this government lacks.
Resuming